And we are moving right along, going on to the Cleveland Browns now, the other orange team that plays in Ohio in the AFC North. So to start out with the Cleveland Browns, just give a little bit of background on where we're coming from. This is a team since they've come back into the NFL in 1999. They have only made the playoffs just two, two times in the span of 23 seasons, or I scratched that, 24 seasons, excuse me. Only playoff appearances coming in 2002 and 2020. So for a fan base as passionate as Cleveland, this is definitely an organization, fan base, I'm sure the players feel as well, that is absolutely starved for some playoff success. And they very well may find it this year. So this was a Cleveland Browns team last year in 2022 that had a record of 7-10, finishing last in the AFC North, showing just how brutal that division is. I believe that is going to stand as probably the toughest division in the NFL this year. So, looking at the 2022 Browns, not really too many notable things here. This is a team that was very middle of the pack in pretty much a lot of regards when it comes to offense, when it comes to defense, when it comes to in terms of rushing. Well, rushing the ball, they were actually pretty high up here in terms of yards and touchdowns. Could thank Nick Chubb for that one, but definitely struggled in terms of defending the rush, but they excelled at defending the pass, whereas they struggled to pass on offense. Very much a yin and yang kind of situation for the Cleveland Browns. Looking at their schedule last year, didn't start off too shabby. Started off with a 2-1 record here, but things quickly went off the rails before they got a big win over the Cincinnati Bengals right before the bye week. Although after that, it was already kind of too little too late. They ended up playing about 500 the rest of the way here, but even then, end up with just a 7-10 record. And they end up going, let's see, they lose 1, 2, 3 games in the division. So it looks like they go 3-3 in the division, beating the Steelers, the Bengals, and the Ravens each one time, and then losing to each of them one time. Sounds about right for the 2022 Cleveland Browns. So definitely, if they want to have a chance of winning the AFC North, they'll need to improve on that. 3-3 should be the minimum that they're looking for in terms of divisional games. Looking at their passing statistics, Jacoby Brissett was the guy to start the season. Of course, Deshaun Watson returns from his suspension to finish out the year, although by the time Deshaun Watson does get in there, really isn't the guy that we remembered seeing in Houston. Comes in and he throws 5 interceptions in 6 games started. Jacoby Brissett only threw 6 in 11 games started, so he was actually taking care of the football better than Deshaun Watson. And while Deshaun Watson was throwing touchdowns at a higher rate here than Jacoby Brissett, he offsets it with interceptions and turning the ball over at an even higher rate than that. So Jacoby Brissett is no longer with the Cleveland Browns. This is 1,000% Deshaun Watson's team. Definitely can assess that based off of the contract he received, and we'll look more at that as we go along here. But moving on to just some other quick Brown statistics here from 2022. We won't spend too much time on the 2022 Browns. It's not really too much to note, but Nick Chubb, absolutely tremendous season. One of the few bell cow running backs remaining in the NFL. 302 carries for over 1,500 yards, 12 touchdowns on the ground, and another one receiving. And Kareem Hunt also picks up another 468 yards here. Jacoby Brissett, another 243, but neither of these players are with the Cleveland Browns anymore, so definitely interesting to keep an eye on that as well. We can even look at the receiving stats here a little bit. Amari Cooper leading the pack with over 1,000 yards. Donovan Peoples-Jones, not a bad season, but not really too much doing after David Njoku. It's kind of those three and then not really much else. We can take a quick peek at the defense as well. Myles Garrett, pretty much the only guy getting to the quarterback here, but my God, did he get to the quarterback a lot. 16 sacks on the season, 2 forced fumbles, 26 quarterback hits, and 18 tackles for a loss. Absolute game wrecker there on the defensive side for the Cleveland Browns. Definitely worthy of that number 1 overall pick back in 2017. So now let's look at what the Browns did in the offseason. So Cleveland And we'll give the quick recap here. This shows what team the player was with in 2022. This column shows where they have moved on to in 2023. And then over here we've got what percentage of snaps they played for their team in 2022. I will say before we even get into some of the players here, big notable move they made even before this was bringing in Jim Schwartz as their defensive coordinator. So definitely a big change for them. He's a big proponent of the 4-3 defense, big on getting to the quarterback. Definitely think a player like Myles Garrett will benefit from playing in a scheme such as Jim Schwartz. But let's look at what the Browns do now in response to that in their offseason. So some of the notable players that they lose here. We'll start off down with the more difficult name to pronounce here, and I did look up how to pronounce this. He originally started with the New England Patriots here, and this is pronounced Yalda Froholt. And he went from the Cleveland Browns to the Arizona Cardinals, played just over 50% of snaps last year. Shouldn't be a massive loss for the Cleveland Browns. I am still very confident in their offensive line. Think it's definitely one of the best units in the entire National Football League. And we'll look at that as we get to the depth chart more in depth, no pun intended. Some of the other players they lost here, let's see if I can find them. Taven Bryan, interior defensive lineman, played 58% of snaps last year. He moves on to the Indianapolis Colts. Another player that moved on, Jacoby Brissett, as we mentioned earlier, quarterback, going to the Washington Commanders. And I'll mention John Johnson, safety, who moves on to the Los Angeles Rams. He played nearly 97% of snaps last year in his age 28 season. Another interesting player to note here as well, I guess you could say two interesting players to note here. Kareem Hunt, who remains unsigned, was the 1B to that, or I guess the number 2, I guess you could say, to that 1-2 punch at running back last year with himself and Nick Chubb being the 1. And then Jadeveon Clowney, former first overall pick from the Houston Texans, still unsigned as well, spending his 2022 season with the Cleveland Browns, playing 45% of snaps. But not really too many notable departures for the Cleveland Browns. I think all of those guys are definitely players they'll be able to, don't want to say live without, because they definitely brought a lot to the Browns last year, but definitely players that they should be able to recuperate their losses. So let's look at some of the players the Browns brought in. I'd say the first guy to really start with here is Juan Thornhill, safety they bring in from the Kansas City Chiefs, and right away that's certainly going to be a player who can replace John Johnson at the safety position and brings a winning mentality with him. Always think it's a good idea to bring in players who have won a Super Bowl with another team. Just really having a veteran player there who's seen what it takes to get to the top, huge asset to have. Another player who they bring in is Rodney McLeod, also a safety that won a Super Bowl. He won it with Jim Schwartz in Philadelphia, Super Bowl 52. So they're definitely, even though they lost John Johnson at safety, you could say they technically upgraded the position. Rodney McLeod is definitely at the latter end of his career. This might be his last stop in Cleveland in the National Football League, but he's not expected to start this year. So definitely a nice depth pickup for them at only just over $1 million this year. Then they bring in a pair of defensive linemen from Minnesota, one edge rusher and one interior guy. Edge rusher being Zadarius Smith, which was technically a trade. They bring him in at age 31. And then they also bring in Dalvin Tomlinson, interior player who is about age 29. He played just under 50% of snaps for Minnesota last year, so not bad when all's said and done. Then one other player I will note before we move on is Elijah Moore. The Browns acquire him in a trade from the New York Jets. He's only the age of 23, and the Browns did trade a second-round pick to the New York Jets for Elijah Moore and a third-round pick. So we'll look at the Browns draft now. That's probably a good segue, and the Browns were in a bit of a sticky situation heading into this draft because they didn't have their first-round pick due to the Deshaun Watson trade with the Houston Texans, excuse me. Yes, the Cleveland Browns traded that pick to the Houston Texans. That ended up being the 12th overall selection, which the Houston Texans ended up using to trade up to select Will Anderson all the way up at number 3 overall. So looking at the players the Browns actually selected, when all was said and done, they ended up with 2 third-round picks, 2 fourth-round picks, 2 fifth-round picks, and 1 6th-round pick. In the 3rd round, they take Cedric Tillman, wide receiver out of Tennessee. They take Siaki Ika, defensive lineman out of Baylor, giving them even more depth on that defensive line. Then they take DeJuan Jones, tackle from Ohio State, good value there in the 4th round. He was somebody that was definitely being mentioned as a day 2 pick. Then they also pick up Isaiah McGuire, more depth for that defensive line. Then they kind of just take a flyer on another quarterback here in round 5, in case they need somebody to back up Deshaun Watson now that Jacoby Brissett's gone. Probably more of a project. He might even be their 3rd quarterback to start the season. Then Cameron Mitchell, defensive back from Northwestern, and Luke Weipler from Ohio State, another offensive lineman from Ohio State. So Cleveland is a team that very much values the offensive line, and we'll see that now as we look forward to their depth chart for 2023. Granted, this is not an official depth chart like I have mentioned with the other teams we've looked at. We're still very much in the early stages of camp, although we do have the luxury of Cleveland being the only team we've seen in action so far. They played in the Hall of Fame game last week against the New York Jets, the Elijah Moore revenge game, if you will. But breaking down the Browns depth chart here, of course, at quarterback, we have Deshaun Watson, acquired from the Houston Texans last year, signed the big money contract. Love him or probably hate him. He is their starting quarterback, backed up by Joshua Dobbs, formerly of the Pittsburgh Steelers, more recently the Tennessee Titans. And then here is the aforementioned rookie, Dorian Thompson-Robinson, who figures to be more of a project. But Joshua Dobbs really hasn't been anything special in the National Football League, so this could definitely be Dorian's job there by the end of the year if he plays his cards right. Looking at the running back position, behind Nick Chubb, we have Jerome Ford and Demetric Felton Jr. And I will flash back to the 2022 Browns stats real quick because I do find it interesting. While, yes, Kareem Hunt was on the roster here, these two players, so here's Jerome Ford and then here's Demetric Felton. These guys combined for 8 yards on the ground last year. Jerome Ford had 12 and Demetric Felton had -4 when all was said and done. So these are young players still. Jerome Ford's going to be 24 this year and Demetric Felton will be 25. But when these are going to be players taking over for a player of Kareem Hunt's caliber behind Nick Chubb, definitely leaves you scratching your head a little bit. And definitely, if you're the Browns, have to cross your fingers that Nick Chubb doesn't have any injuries this year. Although the Browns do have one of the strongest offensive lines in the NFL. So, hey, if anybody out there plays fantasy football, you probably know this, but keep an eye on Nick Chubb. He's somebody who seems to be perpetually slept on. And the fact that the Browns' offensive line is so strong is definitely a big reason for that. Now, that seems like a good segue into the Browns' offensive line. And like I mentioned earlier, this is one of the premier units in the entire National Football League. So we have Jedrick Wills, their 2020 first-round pick, starting at left tackle. He's been everything they could expect out of him so far. Really no complaints from him there. Joel Patino as their left guard. He's been there since 2014. One of the more underrated guards in the National Football League for sure. He's been very consistent for them over, my gosh, this will be his 10th season now. So definitely having a nice long career there for the Cleveland Browns. He was somebody who used to share the line with Joe Thomas. Now he's sharing it with Jedrick Wills there. Then moving along to the center position, they have Ethan Pozick, I believe is how you pronounce that. I did look this one up as well. He was with the Browns last year, but he really came on after Nick Harris went down with an injury. So there is a competition going on for the backup center position right now between Nick Harris and the rookie Luke Weipler, which, interesting to note, because if you're the Cleveland Browns, of course, Nick Harris drafted in 2020. This will be a contract year for him, so perhaps you would consider going with Luke Weipler to get him the reps because he's somebody who figures to be in the fold for at least the next 4 seasons if he shows he's worthy of staying on the roster. Moving on to right guard, you have Wyatt Teller. He's been with the Browns for a little while now. Probably, I guess you could say, the weakest link of this offensive line with Pozick, but even then, that's no slight against him at all. There's just so many fantastic players on this offensive line. Jedrick Wills, Joel Patino, and finally Jack Conklin, formerly of the Tennessee Titans. He was a top 10 pick back in that 2016 draft with Jared Goff and Carson Wentz at the top. And he's really proven to be a steady force for the Cleveland Browns at right tackle. And he was when he was with the Tennessee Titans. So anytime you could have stability at the tackle position like this, always an amazing thing for what you can do on offense, because they're definitely the two most important spots on the offensive line. If you could get those two positions right, and then have one guy for sure you can depend on in the middle, it takes a lot of pressure off of these two guys. But even then, they've been delivering on all fronts. This really is a loaded offensive line. And they do have some young players over here as well. They have DeJuan Jones, another rookie here at tackle from Ohio State. Luke Weipler, as we mentioned, from Ohio State as well. So they have players who are ready to step in case of injury. Then they also have James Hudson III over here at the backup left tackle position. Third-year player for them. And then, as we mentioned, Nick Harris on the final year of his rookie contract. So not only do the Browns have a solid starting group here, they have some backups ready to step in too for this year and beyond. So definitely very enthusiastic about the Browns offensive line. And I think that's going to be a big reason for them to have success this year if they find themselves going on a nice little run, which is entirely possible. Looking now at tight end, David Njoku has really solidified himself as the number one tight end for the Cleveland Browns offense. He's been with them since 2017, as you could see, their first round pick that back then. Although there is a bit of a competition going on for the second spot between Harrison Bryant and Jordan Akins. Jordan Akins has, the way his contract's set up, he is probably in Cleveland for at least this year, so you would think he gets the reps, but Harrison Bryant also in a contract year, as he was also drafted in 2020, much like Nick Harris. So be interesting to see how that shakes out, who ends up getting the reps there when all is said and done. Now finally, before we move on to the defense, take a quick look at the wide receiver position. And the top three here are definitely solidified. Amari Cooper is their number one, no questions really asked there. Originally of the Oakland Raiders and more recently of the Dallas Cowboys. Donovan Peoples-Jones, their number two option. About 800 yards last year, as we saw earlier. And then the aforementioned Elijah Moore, who they just traded for from the New York Jets. So Deshaun Watson will definitely have his fair share of weapons around him. He should have solid protection in front of him, and he should have an amazing running back behind him. So definitely set up for success on offense. Very fascinated to see how Deshaun Watson does this year, because we know he can perform at the NFL level. He was somebody who, back when he was drafted in 2017, we were talking about how he was the best quarterback in that class. People were definitely very high on him coming out of Clemson compared to Mitchell Trubisky, and especially compared to Patrick Mahomes. It's kind of funny how that narrative shifted when those two met up in the playoffs in 2019, the Texans and the Chiefs. It was seen as very much, I mean, yeah, Patrick Mahomes had the MVP under his belt already at that point, but especially when the Texans went up 24-0 on them early on, it was seen as, well, I mean, Deshaun Watson very much could be on Patrick Mahomes' level, if not even surpassing him in terms of the quarterback hierarchy. But we've seen, obviously, that narrative shift as the years have gone on. But we know what Deshaun Watson's capable of at the NFL level. And if he's able to get back to that level of play he was playing at in 2019 in Houston particularly, especially in that wild card round against the Buffalo Bills, man, this Browns offense really has the potential to be special. So, moving on to the defense now. Spearheaded by Myles Garrett. Oh, actually, you know what? Before we do move on to the defense, I do want to mention there is a competition going on as well for the number 4 receiver role, going on between Cedric Tillman and David Bell, second-year player for the Cleveland Browns. So, be interesting to keep an eye on that as well. Two younger guys looking to really make their mark on this offense. And like we mentioned, the top 3 receivers are already pretty much set. So whoever wins this competition is probably going to be seeing significantly more reps than the other player. All right, now actually onto the defense. Obviously the star here is Myles Garrett. 18 sacks last year, or might have been 16. Let me double check that. 16 sacks last year, excuse me. So Then we have the new acquisition, Dalvin Tomlinson and Zadarius Smith, definitely helping that defensive line improve. This wasn't one of the better units in the league last year, but anytime you have Myles Garrett, it's going to be a solid unit, let's be real. But adding those two players, plus they go out and draft Siaki Ika in the third round, and then Isaiah McGuire in the fourth round to give it some depth. This should be a top 10 unit in the league this year, at least on paper, but that's why we play the games, right? To see how these guys can really stack up against some live competition. But have a lot of faith in this unit. They definitely value the trenches on this side of the ball as well. Taking Alex Wright in the third round last year's draft. Tommy Togiai, geez, I'm really bad at pronouncing these names. I'm sorry. In the fourth round of 2021. So clearly they have a value for the defensive line. And then Jordan Elliott, defensive tackle in the third round of 2023. And then let's just call this guy Double O, sign him from Houston this offseason as well. He had a noticeable amount of snaps for them, though I did not mention him when talking about the Browns' offseason acquisitions. So looking at the Cleveland Browns defensive line, this is a team that's going to be going up against the Cincinnati Bengals week 1. So if you're Joe Burrow, you're that Bengals staff, maybe you think twice about putting him out there against this defensive line because they definitely are loaded with talent. And definitely would be hesitant to put him out there against Myles Garrett, that's for sure. Looking at their linebackers now, nothing really too amazing here, but definitely a very solid middle of the pack group. Jim Schwartz really doesn't value the linebackers as we saw when he was in Philadelphia, so don't need to waste too much time here on this. The real star of the show for the Browns, though, on defense is their secondary, I would say. And with their secondary, this is probably a top 10 unit in the league as well, if I'm being honest, right up there with the defensive line, because they have their other backbone on defense here, Denzel Ward, holding down the corner position. They also have Grant Delpit back at the safety spot in his fourth year, just went out and acquired Juan Thornhill and Rodney McLeod at the other safety position. Then they're projecting to start Martin Emerson Jr., second-year player at the opposite corner, and Greg Newsome, their first-round pick from 2021 as their nickel corner. So really solid secondary all around. The personnel here definitely seems to fit Jim Schwartz's style of defense. Not really too much. Seems like they have a good investment here in the linebacker spot, but nothing really over the top. That's not really where their stars are. They kind of just need the linebackers to hold their own, while the defensive line is going to be looking to get to the quarterback. I'm sure Myles Garrett's going to go absolutely bonkers this year with even more sacks than he's already put up. And then the secondary is going to look to just kind of hang back and pick up some throws off the back foot of the opposing quarterback. So definitely intrigued by this Browns defense and really this team as a whole, because there's really not an Achilles heel that's sticking out to me. And if it all really comes down to Deshaun Watson, right? If he can play like how he played in Houston, this team could go really far. I truly mean that. This team can go really far. I know Cleveland fans might not like to hear that because they know they can definitely have a tendency to be a bit snake bitten, but I'm a believer in this Browns team this year when maybe a lot of people aren't. And looking now at their schedule, I do have them projected to finish 11-6, missing the playoffs as the 9 seed, but I definitely think that is entirely up for debate. So I have them going 2-4 in the AFC North, but I mean, if we really look at this, I have them losing both games to the Baltimore Ravens, and then where are the Pittsburgh Steelers at here? I'm splitting with the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Cincinnati Bengals. So, say hypothetically they could split with the Baltimore Ravens as well, like they did last year. That puts them in the playoff picture at 12-5, and that kicks Baltimore out. So, definitely don't take too much. I would probably take this with a grain of salt. Don't put too much stock into these predictions at the moment. It's still in the preseason, but that's why we do this. It's all for fun, right? So it just shows that Cleveland has a ton of possibilities here. And who knows, they have 3 of their first 4 games are against divisional teams before their bye week. So if they can come out to a strong start here in the first 4 weeks, that would definitely set them up for success when it comes to competing for this division come the end of the season. So they play the Cincinnati Bengals week 1, and I do stand by that I think they will win this game. Either if Joe Burrow misses it and Trevor Simeon's the starter, especially if that's the case, but even if Joe Burrow isn't there and not quite 100%, I think Jim Schwartz is going to make it a point to get after him, especially with Myles Garrett on that roster. Myles Garrett's probably going to have a big day there. Depends who he's lined up against. It could be against Orlando Brown Jr., but even so, Myles Garrett's an absolute game wrecker. He's going to find a way to get back there, and Joe Burrow's going to need to be getting that ball out quick, even by his standards. So, the Browns win this game, and who knows, say hypothetically, they get off to a hot start here, and they go 4-0 heading into the bye week. They could really set themselves up for success there. I mean, I do have them beating San Francisco coming out of the bye, but say they drop that game if they go 4-0. Then they get Indianapolis, that should be a win. Seattle, that'll be a tough one. Honestly, this will be a pretty evenly matched game, but Cleveland, I feel, is the much stronger team in the trenches. They have the better quarterback. They probably have the better running game, honestly, even though Seattle does have Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet, the rookie. They've both been banged up a little bit in training camp, so I do still like Cleveland in this game. Then they come back against the Arizona Cardinals. That should be a win. Then they get 2 more tough division games here, which I have them splitting. They go on the road to Denver, which they drop here, but LA should be able to win that. Chicago should be able to win that. Houston, these are very winnable games for them. Do have a tough one here against Jacksonville and the Jets, but again, split those 2. Then you finish out against Cincinnati, which very well could be for a playoff spot and absolutely could be for the AFC North. I would absolutely love to see that Battle of Ohio for the AFC North. Feel like that never happens. I grew up in the 2000s, if you couldn't tell, watching the Steelers and Ravens pretty much trade this division every year. So definitely be exciting to see if the Browns can make some noise there. But as it stands with my original predictions, I do have Cleveland finishing at an 11-6 record, which would have them just outside the playoff picture. Now, one more thing I did want to look at would be the Cleveland Browns salary cap situation going forward, because this is very fascinating to me. The contract for Deshaun Watson in particular. So he did restructure that contract this year. Of course, this was a contract that everybody made a huge fuss about last year because it was all guaranteed money, and that was supposed to be this benchmark contract that other teams were going to pay their quarterbacks accordingly. But as we've seen, quarterbacks get paid since then. Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, Justin Herbert. This really hasn't been the precedent. It's more so been looked at as, well, yeah, Cleveland kind of screwed up over there. We're not really going to follow that logic, but I don't think this is a screw up for Cleveland. They did want to get their franchise quarterback. Looking at what Baker Mayfield's done since he's left Cleveland, I think they made the correct decision in moving on from him. Word is coming out of Bucs camp that he's even struggling to beat out Kyle Trask for a starting job. Baker Mayfield's projected to start the first preseason game, but Kyle Trask is rumored to be starting the second preseason game against, I believe, the New York Jets. So could even see a taste of that drama on Hard Knocks this year. But Deshaun Watson restructured his deal, so his cap hit's only $19 million this season. But then look at what it explodes to in 2024. It goes up to $63 million over the following 3 seasons. So something's going to have to give there, whether they renegotiate that again or Cleveland's just going to have to move on from some players, because that's absolutely ludicrous to be playing one player about a quarter of the salary cap, maybe even more. So they're projected to have $310 million against the cap next year and another $270 million the following year. So when I say Cleveland should be competing this year, they might need to, because it could get ugly for them beyond this season. And they do have Nick Chubb signed for this season and next season at a good cap hit for a running back. Glad to see Nick Chubb being able to be paid what he's worth. Honestly, even at this figure, he's probably underpaid, but fascinating because next year could very well be his last year in Cleveland, especially if Deshaun Watson is still making this very large sum of money. But it's all guaranteed, so they can't really move him. I doubt another team would want to trade for that. Looking at the wide receiver spot, Amari Cooper signed for this season and the following at $23 million. These years are voided in 25 and 26, so they really only have him for a 2-year window, much like Nick Chubb. Looking at other wide receivers here, Donovan Peoples-Jones in a contract year. He'll certainly be due for a raise. And Elijah Moore only signed for the next 2 years, and he'll certainly want more than 1.879 million in 2025. Moving on to tight end, they do have David Njoku on a nice little extension here for 2 years beyond the season. So he definitely figures to be in the fold long term, at least for the foreseeable future. Then we get down to the offensive line. They're paying Wyatt Teller pretty handsomely, both of their guards, and Joel Patino, much deserved. Like we mentioned, these are two of the better guards in the National Football League, so definitely nice to see them being paid accordingly. And then Jack Conklin, their right tackle, locked up for the next 4 years. So this offensive line is definitely going to be intact here, although Jedrick Wills is on his 5th-year option next season. If I had to guess, he's probably going to be signing an extension soon, or at least the Browns should sign him to an extension soon. Like we saw, they are in a bit of a muddy waters with their cap situation, but if they were wise, they would find some room to be able to extend him. Although they do have DeJuan Jones waiting in the wings, and they do have Luke Weipler waiting in the wings if Nick Harris walks after the season, which is entirely possible. Looking at the defense, Myles Garrett being paid handsomely as he definitely deserves over the next 4 seasons. He's going to be here for a long time. Cleveland Browns would be absolutely just idiotic to even consider moving on from him. Dalvin Tomlinson locked up long term. Got Double O here locked up for the next 3 seasons. Jordan Elliott in a contract year, although they do have Siaki Ika they drafted under contract for the next 4 years. So if he proves to be a productive player here his rookie year, Cleveland would definitely be more willing to move on from some of these other defensive tackles if push comes to shove with the salary cap. Looking at linebacker, they do have their 2 starters here locked up for the next 2 seasons, so not really too much of a sweat there. And even just knowing Jim Schwartz from his time in Philadelphia, he's not afraid to just let linebackers walk and replace them with late round draft picks and undrafted free agents. So if I'm Cleveland, I'm not really sweating this too much. Finally, at the secondary, they've got Denzel Ward locked up long term, as they definitely should. Greg Newsome due for a potential 5th-year option in 2025. Imagine he stays. Grant Delpit in a contract year. Would like to see him re-signed, although might be rather difficult given Cleveland's cap situation. Then Juan Thornhill signed for the next 3 years. So very fascinating with the Cleveland Browns. I definitely think they're a team, looking back at the AFC real quick, a lot of very interesting teams in the AFC this year. A lot of teams garnering hype. Obviously the Kansas City Chiefs, Cincinnati Bengals, Buffalo Bills, probably the 3-headed monster at the top of this conference. Though you do still have Jacksonville, who, seen as an up-and-coming team, won their division last year. We know Tennessee's capable of a deep playoff run. The Jets just acquired Aaron Rodgers. The Miami Dolphins with that dynamic receiving duo. New England Patriots, coached by Bill Belichick, you can never count them out. Pittsburgh Steelers, Mike Tomlin coaching them. They've had a pretty strong offseason. The Los Angeles Chargers, Justin Herbert, and that loaded offense with Austin Eckler. Denver Broncos now with Sean Payton. Just so much going on in this AFC. A team like Cleveland kind of slips under the radar, although I think, honestly, they don't have flash in maybe the most media-friendly positions, I guess you could say. But the Cleveland Browns have flash where it counts. They have the talent in the trenches. They have the talent in the secondary. If they have the talent at quarterback, that could go a long way, but it's all on Deshaun Watson to see where really this team goes, because he has the weapons around him. He has a good group of receivers, and he has one of the best running backs in the NFL in Nick Chubb. So love to hear from the Dawg Pound. What do you guys think the Browns are capable of this year? Do you have confidence in Deshaun Watson to get these guys in the playoffs? If they're back in the playoffs, how far do you think they go? All right, and that's all I really got. So look forward to hearing from me in the next video. And I believe Dallas is the next team, so that should be a fun one. Have a nice